Welcome to the Sloth Investor podcast with your host, Mr. Sloth.
The information on this podcast is provided for education and informational purposes only. The information contained in or provided from or through this podcast is not intended to be and does not constitute advice of any kind. Welcome everyone to episode 12 of the Sloth Investor podcast, an investing podcast that explores why I believe the humble sloth is the best animal to characterize successful investing. And this week's episode is sponsored by the book Becoming an International School Teacher by Jess Gosling. Jess is an international school teacher in Taiwan, and she's previously worked in Japan, Egypt, and Vietnam. And her book is a great resource for international school teachers and those looking to work abroad. Within the book, you'll find information about the practicalities of moving abroad, key options for singles, couples, and families, and how to find the best fit in terms of location and school. It's a recommended book for those of you working in international schools and those looking to move abroad and work in your first international school. Okay, Jay. Another episode 12. We're moving away from episode 11, which of course is your hockey jersey number, and now into episode 12. How are you?
You know what? That book you just mentioned, when you're done with it, I've got to give it a read, because I wish when I moved abroad as a Canadian expat, I had a resource like that to help me out. So I want to borrow that from you when you're done, so I can have some insight into what it would be like for me to move if I moved overseas.
Absolutely. So many questions I know were percolating in my mind when my wife and I moved abroad around about 11 years ago. So I think a resource like that would be great. And what a great idea for a book. Absolutely great idea indeed. Yeah.
Tell me more. What's on our agenda for today?
So Jay, episode 12, I think it's about time that we started digging into some great investing books. And I've just recently finished one of my favorite all-time investing books. It's a really insightful, well-written book. And the author's name is William Green. And the book is entitled Richer, Wiser, Happier: How the World's Greatest Investors Win in Markets and Life.
Nobody asked him to borrow the book because I'm first in line. This is one of those books that I've got queued up that's on next on my agenda. So no one, don't even bother asking right now, because I get first dibs.
It's true, Jay. And, listeners, it's right next to me. It's centimeters away from me. And after the podcast is over today, I'm handing a book over. It's a great read. And, Jay, I've read numerous investing books over the years, and this is right up there as one of the best that I've read.
So tell me, I know we've had some discussions prior to today's episode about sort of your key takeaways from the book and what sort of attracted me to it. Can you talk about some of the key points from this book that resonated with you, and the notion of cloning?
Yeah, Jay, so, this is a notion that I really wasn't familiar with before. Certainly this whole concept of cloning that William Green speaks about. And let me take some time now to explore this idea of cloning, a key element of the book, and why I believe that this idea of cloning, is not just applicable to investing, but to multiple aspects of life. Okay, so the basic premise of cloning is the simple idea that you build on the smart ideas of others by replicating aspects of what they do. So in other words, it involves copying the best of what other people have figured out. And interestingly, William Green, the author of Richer, Wiser, Happier, states that the overarching purpose of his book is to share what he calls ideas worth cloning. Okay, so he writes how this idea of cloning stems from Manish Pabrai, and that this individual has used cloning extensively to become a successful investor. Okay, so for those unfamiliar, Manish Pabrai is an Indian-American businessman who admired the success of Warren Buffett from afar, and then set out to clone Buffett's approach with a high level of attention to detail. Okay, and here's a great quote from Manish Pabrai that William Green uses in the book. Begin quote. "Humans have something weird in their DNA which prohibits them from adopting good ideas easily. What I learned a long time back is keep observing the world inside and outside your industry. And when you see someone doing something smart, force yourself to adopt it." End quote. So for Pabrai, there were three important concepts that he learned from Buffett, that Buffett himself learned, or you could say cloned, from Benjamin Graham, one of the all-time giants of the investment world. In short, the first concept is that when you're buying a stock, you're buying a portion of an ongoing business with an underlying value, not just a piece of paper for speculators to trade. Second, both Buffett and Benjamin Graham viewed the market as a voting machine and not a weighing machine, which means that stock prices commonly fail to reflect the true value of businesses. The third concept or takeaway for Manish Pabrai was that you should buy a stock when it's selling for much less than your conservative estimate of its worth. William Green uses a great quote from Warren Buffett on the importance of learning from other people. Begin quote. If you learn, basically, from other people, you don't have to get too many ideas on your own. You can just apply the best of what you see. End quote.
I have to, okay, just by hanging out with you, I'm a better person because you're so well read that I can just, the idea of cloning. Okay, all right. I want to talk more about this briefly, but the concept of cloning, it just relates to so many aspects in life, and for me, I can't help but think of the idea that, you have these ideas and these models, and then I think like, I'm going to take, I like that applies to me. I can make that work. I can clone that idea. Yeah. But it's not just investing. It goes beyond investing.
And that's the great thing about this particular book, because it really resonates with me in so many different ways, and it will resonate with so many other people. It's not purely just a book about investing. I'm sure that listeners will find that this book can be related to so many other aspects of their life. Okay, so let's take the notion of cloning. It can be applied to so many different domains, so many different realms. So, excuse me. Anyone who knows me will know that I'm a massive fan of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, two of my favorite bands. I've mentioned it a few times. And when I think back to the Beatles, I know that they clone certain aspects of their big influences. When I'm thinking about the Beatles, I think of Buddy Holly. I think about Elvis, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lewis, Little Richard. I think back to some of the kind of the woos, you hear at the end of the Beatles songs, you hear in She Loves You and several of the other songs. I remember listening to an interview of Paul McCartney, and Paul McCartney's father, would speak to him about this. Why are you making these strange sounds? And McCartney would talk to him about the fact, well, I've got it from Little Richard. He'd cloned that from Little Richard. I'm thinking about the Stones. I'm thinking about big influences on Mick Jagger and his dancing. James Brown, Tina Turner, the guys that the Stones hung out with in the 60s and so on. I'm thinking as well about the world of cinema. Now, Jay, you and I, how many times now have we spoken about the world of cinema within this podcast? But Tarantino, one of the most popular, one of the most esteemed and successful directors of the last, 30 to 40 years now. But again, anyone who's familiar with the spaghetti westerns of the 60s, I know that I grew up in those movies. My dad was a big fan of those spaghetti westerns, will definitely see the influence of those movies on Tarantino's work, particularly films such as Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight. These movies, the Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight, really, you can definitely see that link between the spaghetti westerns of the 60s, particularly starring Clint Eastwood, and Tarantino's movies. Okay, so I've got a great quote here from Tarantino upon this fact, okay? This is what he says, begin quote. I've suffered forever from Sergio Leone-itis, where I can't introduce a character unless I've spent 15 minutes doing it and making it a huge operatic aria, okay? End quote. And for those unfamiliar with Sergio Leone, he is a director from the 60s, predominantly made movies in the 60s, and will be forever known for the great spaghetti westerns that he directed during that time period, particularly starring Clint Eastwood, such as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, A Fistful of Dollars, and For a Few Dollars More. So a key influence in Tarantino. And anyone who's watched movies from Tarantino, such as The Hateful Eight and Django Unchained, will definitely see how Tarantino's cloned some of those ideas from Sergio Leone. Okay, and I think as well about the world of art as well, and how many artists, okay, throughout history have cloned ideas from other artists, okay? They've been influenced by artists that went before them. Got a great quote here from Salvador Dali. Those who do not want to imitate anything produce nothing, okay? And to end on this point, I've got a great quote by a Japanese artist, Yoji Yamamoto, and he states, start copying what you love, Copy, 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 copy. At the end of the copy, you will find yourself. Okay, so for me, this notion of cloning is something that I think we can certainly apply to investing, but we can apply to so many other realms of life as well. And that for me was one of the key takeaways from this book by William Green, Richer, Wiser, Happier. Okay, we can see as well that so many investors have cloned ideas from other great investors that have gone before them. Okay, so Jay, what are your thoughts on this idea of cloning? Does it resonate with you? And if so, how have you used cloning in your own life?
Yeah, it's funny because I grew up a fan of R&B and rap music. I was inspired by my two cousins who listened to it nonstop, big basketball culture, and that was a big part of it. And I didn't realize until I got older that a lot of the music that was in part or part of the or an important part of the songs from that era were actually sampled from music and song and R&B rhythm and blues from the 60s, from the 70s, and that was news to me. And then I thought about, as you were talking, today I taught a class and I was showing students a video that I had made that I thought was entertaining and inspiring. And the idea that everything is a remix. I stole that idea from monster truck commercials when I was a kid. And I thought those were utterly ridiculous, but funny and entertaining. And I took that and I applied that to the video that I had made, modern day version of it, for something else. And so I can totally see how, the illusion of original thought, the idea that there is no original thought because everything's a remix. You're taking something that's inspired you and you're either making your own copy of it, your own version of it.
I love that phrase, the illusion of original thought. That's a really great phrase. I love that in particular. So it's interesting that you mentioned hip hop as well. I'm just thinking back to James Brown. I mentioned him a few times, but I think about James Brown's influence on the Rolling Stones, a massive influence, particularly Mick Jagger. And I think about James Brown's influence on the world of hip hop. I just know from having watched various documentaries about hip hop and read about hip hop, I know that James Brown and his band was sampled by many hip-hop artists of the 1970s. Okay, so as we bring our discussion of cloning to an end, I'll use a quote that William Green utilizes in the book, and it's from Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's right-hand man. Begin quote, "I learned a lot from a lot of dead people. I always realized that there were a lot of dead people I ought to get to know." End quote.
I love that quote. I love that. Yeah. Genius. Now, before we move on, but let's back up our truck a bit. How does this term cloning apply to the formation of the Sloth Investor? Like, how can you make that work for you and apply that to you as an investor?
That's a great point, Jay. Great question. So, as much as many people in the last 6 months have championed the Bedrock principles and have sent me nice messages, and we've both been giving great feedback on the podcast, I must admit, it's not entirely wholly new what I'm discussing here in terms of my thoughts, my philosophies with regards to investing. Okay, so other investment writers have written about the importance of low fees, and think about Andrew Hallam, for example, is one that sticks out in my mind. Other writers have spoken about the importance of diversification, a real, globally diversified portfolio. I've spoken about Lars Kroyer before, but what I've sought to do, okay, I've sought to really create this neat little package that synthesizes and encapsulates the essence of investing for those that want to invest in a simple and inactive way. Okay, so my 5 bedrock principles, they represent that nice, neat little package that synthesizes all that I've learned about investing. Okay, so I've cloned ideas from other investors, from a synthesis of ideas from whether it's Andrew Hallam, Lars Kroyer, Morgan Housel, Buffett himself, Ben Carlson. All of these people that I've read and been a fan of over the years, they've helped me in terms of forming my own compound creation, my own belief, my own philosophy in investing, and that is, of course, the Sloth Investor.
And I have to say, for me personally, what I really like about how you use the word package, I like how you bundled this up. And I've read a lot of from the work of Motley Fool. I've read a lot of the work from Seeking Alpha, a lot of the work from Andrew Hallam. And you've put it nice and tidily into an acronym. And that works for me, and that resonates with me. You simplified it even further. So there's a lot of great information from all those sources for me as an investor, but you have bundled it in a way that actually makes it quick and accessible, and you can break it down. I can break it down to my own son when we talk about investments. You know, like, oh, these are the principles you need to keep in mind as yourself as an investor, and keep coming back to those over and over and over again.
And that's great, Jay. I mean, that is just great to hear. And what's really, really pleasing to me is that, every now and again, I'll get some lovely feedback from a particular listener of the podcast. And just a few days ago, I received some feedback from someone on our previous episode. We spoke about inflation for a little while, if you remember, in episode 11. And a gentleman from the States sent me a message, and he stated that he and his 8-year-old daughter were having a conversation in the car about inflation after listening to the episode. And that was just music to my ears. To hear that is great. You know, the younger you get started investing, the younger you learn these financial literacy terms, it's really important. So it's great to have that feedback.
And that feedback is, I think, motivating for us too. I think I said previously that my son's friend Luke I was talking with him, and he said, I've listened to your podcast. Like, say what? Really? He's like, yeah, I listen to it when I'm walking around, and I listen to it. And I thought, wow, that's actually rewarding that potentially I'm helping lay the groundwork for somebody to be a smart investor. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's a quote here, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but a great quote from a French writer just before we close our discussion of cloning. But it's from a French writer, André Gide, and he basically states, everything that needs to be said has already been said, but since no one was listening, everything must be said again. So maybe I won't go as far as to say no one was listening in terms of people's philosophies and people's ideas in general, but the idea about everything must be said again. Certain ideas and concepts are discussed, but maybe they need to be simplified. They need to be broken down and put into a nice, simple, easy to understand package. So I really love that idea again. Much of what we hear, whether it's music, whether we are viewing a piece of artwork, has been said, but it's about putting it out there in your own unique way. So I love that quote in particular as well.
And we see that in education, I think, all the time, that I'll tell my mom the latest trends in education. She's like, oh my gosh, we are doing that in the 80s.
Yeah.
You're just rebranding it. But there is no more sort of the illusion of original thought, right?
I love that phrase, Jay. I love it. Yeah. Uh-huh. Can I clone it? Do you mind if I clone it?
Make it yours.
Yeah.
I want you to share with us any other takeaways. I know there was another one another takeaway that you had, something that really resonated with you from the book. Can you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jay. Another key takeaway from the book for me was the notion of behaving differently from the majority, or what William Green calls the willingness to be lonely. In fact, that's the title of chapter 2 of the book.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that. The willingness to be lonely.
Yeah.
What does that mean for me as an investor? The willingness to be lonely.
Yeah, let me expand upon that. So when I read this section of the book, my 5th bedrock principle of being headstrong came to mind, okay? And of course, that was episode 5 of our podcast. So essentially, William Green writes about how important it is to separate from the crowd and to think for ourselves. So of course, this is easier said than done. After all, we're genetically wired to follow the crowd. It's part of our DNA. And this is what William Green writes in the book upon this very matter. Begin quote. The human genetic code developed over hundreds of thousands of years to support the primary objective of survival. One lesson we learned at least 200,000 years ago is that it's safer to belong to a tribe. End quote. So let's think about what can compel us to behave in this herd-like manner when it comes to investing. The financial media and the frequent prophecies of doom, maybe our friends and family, and perhaps quite simply our willingness to want to be part of the crowd, to not diverge from the norm. So William Green utilizes some great quotes to further underline his point about thinking for oneself. For example, this is from Francois Rochon, a Canadian money manager. Begin quote. I think some people in a race don't have that tribal gene, and these people can become good investors because they can think for themselves. End quote. So detaching yourself from the norms of the crowd is key to your success as an investor. Green also quotes from Christopher Davis, a gentleman that oversees about 25 billion US dollars in assets at Davis Advisors, an investment firm based in Arizona. This is what Davis states, begin quote. A necessary characteristic of great investors is that they can't be overly influenced by what other people think. If you really don't notice and really don't care about what other people think, that will make it easier to be a great investor, end quote. So Jay, what are your thoughts on this ability to diverge from the crowd, to go it alone?
Well, I liken it to my own self when I'm looking at a stock and I'm deciding whether or not it's something I want to invest in. I actually look at the analyst ratings as one of my tools, and what do other analysts say? And if other analysts are bearish on it, rightly or wrongly, that's an important factor for me. But then the more you spoke, the more I thought about the movie The Big Short.
Ah, yeah.
And The Big Short, if you don't know it, it's a terrific, compelling movie about the financial crisis and how everybody was sort of just going along like sheep. But there was one analyst in particular who's like, look, we're heading for a crisis. And he called the crisis. And he was able to come out of it relatively unscathed because he was able to foresee what was going to happen. Rather than following along blindly like it with everybody else, he is able to use his own tools to analyze what was happening and say that something was wrong. What was his name? What's the name of that investor?
Michael Berry. Is it Michael
Is that his
Berry?
name?
Yeah, I think so. It's Michael Berry. Yeah. Hey, and as you're talking, I just thought about another movie connection. We can't help but make movie connections on the show, but I'm thinking about The Gathering Storm, and it's set in the 1930s. And basically, it's about that time in the 1930s where, Nazi Germany is gaining in power and they're building up their military capabilities. And there's a lone voice in the British Parliament, and it's Winston Churchill. And he's trying to raise everybody's suspicion and trying to speak candidly about what he sees as going on in Germany at the time. And, in a movie, it's quite interesting. People tell, you sit down, Winston, you silly old man, enough, Winston. But again, he doggedly talks again and again resolutely about what he sees as that danger, in Germany at the time. And again, he didn't, relent. He was willing to kind of diverge from the crowd, to speak his mind. So, we can speak about, again, how we can apply these lessons to investing, but also when we look at so many other realms of life, for example, geopolitics, as we're discussing here, how that ability to speak one's mind is so important. So yeah, it's fascinating. It really is. So Jay, I want to talk about now another takeaway from the book, and it's something that William Green talks about in terms of resilience. Okay, so when it comes to the realm of investing, the self-destruction button is relatively easy to press for too many investors. And to borrow a song title from one of my favorite all-time bands, I'm going to mention them again, the Beatles, investing is certainly a long and winding road. So William Green interviewed many investors for Richer, Wiser, Happier. And one of them was Matthew McLennan, an Australian who works at First Eagle Investment Management. McLennan uses a great analogy when he discusses his mother's love of gardening and the care and consideration that she demonstrated towards her garden. And I've actually got the book in front of me now. I'm going to read it. And you know me, guys, listeners, I love analogies. And I'm just going to share this great analogy that Matthew McLennan makes between gardening and investing. Okay, so reading from the book, McLennan's, when he's talking to William Green being interviewed by William Green, he's reminded of watching his mother gardening while he was growing up in Australia. There was always a problem: dry weather, wilting vines, bug infestations. He often wondered why she bothered to keep going. It would have been so much easier to let the forest grow or just settle for a lawn that needed mowing perhaps just once a week. But her care yielded remarkable results over 3 decades. And this is him speaking now, in quotation marks. What I saw play out over time was the gradual emergence of this beautiful, beautiful garden that took time. It took selectivity. And I think it's a good metaphor for investing. Close quote there. So I really love that. I really love that analogy that he's made there between the realm of investing and gardening. Okay, plant a few seeds, watch them grow, nurture them over time, cultivate them, and the wonders of what you can produce can be utterly amazing.
Can I make a comparison between?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so I grow microgreens. I have a hydroponics unit and I grow microgreens. Oh my gosh. And the visuals were coming to my mind as you were speaking.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I grow rocket and I put it in my salad. And what was happening, I couldn't stop it from growing. So exactly what you had said. I'd sowed the seed and planted it and it had taken off. And I was like, oh, okay, this is great. But it was growing abundantly. I'd pick it and got to the point actually where I was kind of hoping, like, I'm going to pick so much that I just hope it dies. And so I sat back and did nothing. I didn't have the heart to kill my plant, but I wanted to actually sort of have an excuse to stop growing it because it was just, I couldn't eat it fast enough. And so I picked so much one day and I thought, oh, I'll just let it go. And went back like 2 weeks later and the thing had taken off again. It would just continued.
Yeah.
I couldn't keep it down. I guess that's almost like a stock that if you just forget about it and leave it, potentially, hopefully, and that's, I think we've seen over time that the best investors make the people who just sort of tuck it away and forget about it and then come back to it at another time.
Absolutely. Inactivity. Okay. I mentioned that before. 99.99% of successful investment for me is inactivity, doing nothing. The rest, that 0.01%, buying your funds, buying and selling. But fundamentally, 99.99% of successful investing comes down to inactivity. And I love the connection that you can make, Jay, between what you're growing and, of course, also what you're growing in terms of your investments. Okay, so this really brings a close to our first podcast episode devoted to an investing book discussion. And again, I want to reiterate this book that we've explored, okay, Richer, Wiser, Happier by William Green, okay? Not only is it a book that centers upon investing, but I believe that the principles embedded within this book can be applicable to so many aspects of our lives, okay? So listeners, if you have any suggestions for books that we should discuss, then don't hesitate to get in touch. Contact me on Twitter, and Jay and I can see what we can do. So Jay, any closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts, these are some turbulent times right now. We are seeing some, and if anybody who might get scared off, somebody who might be nervous or afraid and a bit gun shy because like, oh, the sky's falling, stay headstrong.
Stay headstrong.
Stay headstrong. Don't give up. And this is all par for the course. Develop that resiliency, that ability to sort of see the forest through the trees, that what's going to be beyond the short-term ups and downs.
Absolutely. So many ideas worth cloning there, that's for sure. Okay, so I think that brings episode 12 to an end. And listeners, we hope you have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you for episode 13.
Have a good one, everybody.
Bye for now.
For more tips, follow the Sloth Investor on Twitter at Sloth_Investor.